Hi there, this is Heather of Shutterbug 101. Today we'll be going over a tips and tricks video on RAW versus JPEG file formats. Let's get started. Hi all, so today we are going over RAW versus JPEG. If you haven't heard of these two file types, we'll go over some definitions, I'll explain exactly what they are and what the benefit is of each. So generally in every handheld camera you have two options. You have RAW and you have JPEG. While both have their benefits, one may benefit you more than the other. Both are amazing image files, but the ability of having free time will dictate exactly which file format to settle in. Because a RAW image requires you to go into a digital darkroom and edit the image, while a JPEG provides you one immediate file. Let's start by breaking down exactly what a RAW image is. A RAW file is exactly what it's called. It's raw, uncompressed, and unaltered data that has not yet been converted into a picture format. In the world of digital data in our everyday cameras, RAW files will contain the most information and is roughly 3 times larger than a standard JPEG image. Depending on your camera, it may define itself as RAW, NEF, CR2, ORF, RW2, AWR, and other ways for manufacturers to distinguish themselves from the other. If you're working with a Windows computer, you won't see these files as a preview, you'll just see a file. Depending on the file in Apple, it may give you a preview, so you want to make sure that you pay attention to exactly what file format that one is before taking it to your nearest print bar and trying to print pictures. Because, as you know, a RAW file is raw footage before it becomes a picture format. So you cannot print a RAW file until it has become a JPEG, and we'll go more into that. Because a RAW file is large and uncompressed, it will allow you the most control over the image and give you the ability to collect slight exposure errors. So, if you own, say, Adobe Photoshop Elements, which is what I would recommend for somebody that's just getting into Photoshop and editing, something like that, it's a one-time payment. You can usually buy it at like Staples, Best Buy. You can even buy it online, I believe, nowadays. And you just need a code to be able to sign on and sign up. Or if you go right into, say, Photoshop CC, these are both going to be Adobe programs, and I would say definitely not just the most popular and reliable, but it has a strong background support, not just from Adobe themselves, but there's tons of tutorials here on YouTube. There is forums and everything for questions that you might have. And like I said, today we're just going over RAW versus JPEG, nothing more than that. We'll also cover how Lightroom would affect RAW and JPEG as well here at the very end. But starting in more of like a Photoshop Elements, Photoshop overlay here, we're going to show you what a RAW file is capable of in editing when it comes to Photoshop. So when you drag a RAW file in, the first thing that you see here is going to be this extra window that pops up. Now, if I try clicking over here, it's not going to allow me to access actual Photoshop until I've done some basic editing here. Now, this specific photo I took at a wedding that I did once upon a time ago, and I shot in both RAW and JPEG. This will allow your camera to capture the photo and save one in a RAW image and one in a JPEG image. The great thing about doing that, especially in a situation where it's a wedding, is if it comes out great as it is, you probably won't feel the need to edit it and you can just provide the JPEG image. But in a situation where it may be too dark, too light, you might want to change some things around there, RAW by far is going to be better to edit, and I will show you why. So starting with the RAW image here, you can see that the middle of the sunflower is really dark. We're not seeing a lot of information there. You know, the rings definitely could be lighter. Overall, it's a great photo, but it really does need some adjustment here. So when we go over here to the right-hand side, I like to start on the basic tab here. So the basic tab will allow you, say, temperature control. If I want to make this a little bit warmer, a little bit cooler. Personally, I like all my photos to run fairly warm, but this photo with the yellow petals is running pretty warm already. So generally, I would just keep it somewhere in the middle, maybe slightly warmer. You can also adjust the tint, which is greens and pinks. So you can make it a little bit pinker, a little bit greener, depending on what you want there. Again, right in the middle is okay. The color in general in this photo is fantastic. From there, what I like to do is skip exposure and contrast for now, because in general, this is pretty good, and start with, like, say, highlights. We'll turn down the highlights a bit. That way we get more detail in these petals here. And we're going to definitely turn up those shadows, and all of a sudden now we're getting all of that detail inside the middle of the sunflower. We're even seeing either some pollen or some dewdrops there as a possibility as well. I'm also going to probably lower the whites, bring up the black tones a bit so we get a little bit more detail. And then I'm going to go in and just up my contrast a bit. Now we're seeing that this photo is really starting to pop. And I'm also seeing that the greens are being a little bit more reflected here. So I'm actually going to turn up the pinks just a bit. Turn down on the blues here. That way we get a little bit more detail in the ring itself. From there, you kind of go on to the next section here where you get texture clarity and dehaze. I'm not seeing much haziness here, but I do want a little bit more clarity when it comes to the ring and all of that detail in the middle there. Then you can adjust vibrance and saturation as well. I would recommend when editing your images, try and stay away from the saturation, because you'll notice if I hike that up, it starts to look really cartoony here, versus if you turn up the vibrance all the way, it just looks like, there's a burst of color. Of course, I'm not going to put it all the way to 100, but if I want a little bit more color pop, you can always do a little bit there. When it comes to Photoshop and editing, most of the time, a little goes a long way. So it's something to definitely keep in mind with that. From there, you also have the curve option, which will allow you to, adjust your grays and whites as well when it comes to these. So you would adjust the middle, then you would adjust a little bit higher here to kind of adjust your whites, and then down on the bottom here, which will adjust the blacks, which I'm going to bring those down just a little bit so I can get more of that shadow in the middle of the sunflower. You can also use your sliders here as well. That's probably the thing that I love most about editing a raw image, is that these sliders are really easy to work with. They're very self-explanatory. With sharpening, you can up that a little bit, but you don't want too much. Again, it can start to make things look a little cartoony or unrealistic. Now, what I like to do with this part, when it comes to the noise reduction, is I like to zoom right into the shadows here. You can see that, zoomed in quite a bit. You can see that we are seeing a little bit of noise in this image here when bringing out the shadows. So what you can do is you can adjust this noise reduction to kind of smooth a little bit of that out. Probably a little too much there. That looks much better, and it looks very high quality here. You also have color noise reduction, which we're not really dealing with this in this situation. You have color mixture if you want to change different colors to different hues, color grading, optics if you're dealing with some distortion there, geometry, even effects like vignetting and calibration as well. I don't typically touch these last few. The top three are usually the ones to go for. And then of course at the very bottom right here, you can toggle back and forth to see before and after. You can see that with RAW, it is a very clear difference just how much editing you can do and how much detail you can pull out of those shadows. That's what makes RAW images so incredible, because of all of that uncompressed data. So at this point here, if we go in and we can open as an object, we can open as copy, we just open in Photoshop in general. So say if you had a person walking in the back of the photo and you wanted to open it in Photoshop at that point, you could do that. Or if you want to save this as a JPEG, you would open it in Photoshop to export it. We're going to open it up here. We have our image. This is the raw image that we're working with. You can tell by the .cr2 file that it's labeled under. That's what this specific camera was saving it under. You can go up to File, go to Export, and export as a JPEG, and then it is ready to print. So you won't have to worry about taking your raw image to a print bar and them going, we can't read this file. It has to be converted to a JPEG image. If you have your image as a JPEG and you decide to edit it in Photoshop, you're not going to have access to the sliders like you would with the raw image, which will bring the window way over here. So we can see these options up on top of the screen. So you have your tools here on the left, but those are more so for manipulating the picture. If we want to change the shadows and highlights, we want to change brightness and contrast, we want to change color like we did with the raw image. Let's go ahead. What we're going to do is we're going to fit the screen with the picture. And you're going to go ahead and go up into the image tab here. Here you can go into adjustments. From there, you can start with curves, you can start with shadows and highlights. Depends on what you want to do. So let's do it in the same order that we did for the raw image. So say shadows and highlights here. Okay, we're going to bring this guy over here. For shadows, we want to try and bump those up all the way like we did on the other one here. You can already see this is starting to look a little gray in comparison to the raw. Now highlights, I had turned those down a bit just to get more information in the petals. Again, we're really starting to look kind of gray here. So let's go ahead, we're going to confirm that. Go back up into image, over to adjustments, and let's go into brightness and contrast. So from here, you can brighten it, you can darken it a little bit. Let's find a nice even tone here. Let's up the contrast to get a bit to make sure we get some of that pop back here. And then let's go ahead, adjust our color, our vibrance, and our saturation. So let's go ahead and tone down the vibrance just a bit because actually, let's keep the vibrance, tone down the saturation a bit because it just seems so bold. It's not coming out right, is it? They go okay. Image. Now let's maybe try curves, you know, because we had played with curves in the other one here. So let's start in the middle, kind of tone that down a little bit. There we go. Start back up the upper part, tone that down a little bit so it's not so posterized. Then we got this one here, which will tone down just a little bit to make the inside of that just a little darker for the flower. Perfect. All right. So you can see that I wasn't able to retrieve nearly as much detail in this as I was on the first one. You can also see here, if I zoom into the image here, you can see that we're not so much seeing noise as we are seeing blotches where it's missing information. We're seeing gray blotches happen here where it starts to look very muddy the more you bring it out. Before we were dealing with noise, but now as you can see here that even the ring not being in shadow or anything like that, it's not coming up very sharp on these edges. It's very blotchy. So with a raw image, you can sharpen it, you can do a lot more to it than you can a JPEG image, as you can see here. If you invest into, say, Lightroom, Adobe Lightroom CC, or even Classic, I'm going to use CC in this video just to show you the simplicity of having the sliders available. So Lightroom is going to give you the sliders like you kind of saw on Photoshop, but it's all going to be sliders. There's very little manipulation that you can do in this because it's mainly to make all of those adjustments. So as you can see here, when I dragged the raw photo in, even though I had just edited it in Photoshop, it saved all those edits, like I told you. So what I can do is I'm going to reset it. So that way we can start over again and kind of go over these things. So the first one here, this is going to be our raw image. Another way you can detect that it's your raw image is you can click the info button down in the right hand corner to see the camera that it was taken with, the lens, the settings here, but the file name is .cr2, which is a raw file. So we're going to start up on the upper tab here, which is going to be the 3 lines with the dots. Those are our adjustment tabs. Typically what you would see in the Photoshop CC. So here we're dealing with light. Like I said, I like to start with the highlights, adjust that here, adjust the shadows. We're going to raise that up all the way. I still think that's a little dark, so I'm going to up the exposure just a bit here. I'm going to lower those highlights a little bit more. Lower the white, lower the black just a little bit to get a little bit more depth, raise the contrast here. Then I'm going to lower into my blues a little bit so I can Try and avoid some of those greens in the ring that it is reflecting back. I'm going to up the vibrance just a tad. I'm going to up the clarity a little bit. I'm going to sharpen it a little bit. And if I zoom into the middle of the flower here, we're seeing those little dots. Those are the visual noise from low light, not loss of information. So if we do our noise reduction here, it's just going to smooth that out just a little bit there to be able to not see it so boldly when you're zoomed back out. So that's kind of our finished product of the raw image versus JPEG. Look, we have the sliders this time versus we didn't in Photoshop. So you can use the sliders for the same way. However, take a look. If we go ahead and lower those highlights here just a little bit, we're going to up the shadows here, right? And lower the white. Bring out the blacks just a little bit more here. Up the contrast. You can see that those colors are already starting to try and supplement the information that's missing, because in RAW it's actually affecting highlights, the whites, shadows, the darks, the blacks, versus on a JPEG image it's also affecting color. So you're gonna see that start to change alongside with everything else you're changing here. I'm gonna lower the vibrance just a tad because it is starting to look a bit posterized here. I'm gonna up the clarity a little bit. There we go. And here we're going to sharpen that a little bit. Zoom right in here so you can see these blotches here that we're seeing. It looks like somebody took an eraser to it. Definitely more than the visual image. Definitely more blotchy. Let's try the noise reduction here. It's, you know, softening those a little bit, but you have to use a lot more noise reduction to get rid of those completely. And now you can start to see that the ring is looking really soft, which we don't want to do. So, you know, to avoid the ring looking really soft, I'm trying to look at both of these here. That's probably the most that you want to do there. So you kind of compare these here, which one is really the winner. The JPEG definitely has much more color, but as you can see here, if we compare it to, say, the ring, where on the raw image you can see that these are very clear lines here, very good detail, versus JPEG. You can see that maybe not so much. You know, it's starting to look really fuzzy after the edit. So if this picture had come out perfect where you were like, I don't have to do any edits to this, the JPEG's already done for you. Great, it's an immediate file, less time for you to spend time on. However, if it comes out looking like the original file here, which you can compare before and after here, versus compare before and after here, still a little bit better, but probably not something that the bride's gonna want to hang on our wall. It's still, if you take this and you go, that's just too dark, I need to edit it, you're better off editing a RAW file than a JPEG file. I hope that this clears things up a little bit for you. When it comes down to it, it really depends on the type of photographer you are and what you plan on doing with your pictures. If you're a hobbyist that just likes to take snapshots, nothing serious, not interested in printing out your work at the moment, you're just playing around and enjoying posting to social media, JPEG is going to be the best and easiest thing for you to do, because it's going to be an immediate file that you can easily edit on like an iPhone or something like that, because iPhones have amazing editorial tools. Or you can even do the Lightroom app as well, which is fantastic, by the way. Otherwise, if you're the type of person that's really getting into photography, people are asking you to take their pictures for portraits, for weddings, for events, for maybe your own personal stuff. You might want to hang your stuff on a wall. Maybe you want to sell your work. I would start pursuing doing raw images. Just make sure that you have your program ready, because I can't tell you how many times that I've had clients come into the shop where they go, hey, so I have no idea what raw files are, but someone told me to tell my photographer to just give me the raw files, and I have them, and now I can't open them because they didn't realize what raw photos were. Make sure that you have the time to spend on your photos to edit them and get them just right, because it is, you know, taking the photography art to a whole new level. But if you guys have any questions about RAW and JPEG, if you want to see me do certain things on Photoshop and introduce those videos to the channel, let me know. I'll be sure to add them to my list. And until next time, keep your eye out for inspiration, Shutterbugs. Bye!